Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your endurance today. My name is Veghte. I'm Vice President for Policy at the National Academy of Social Insurance. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's concluding panel, Where Do We Go From Here? Those of you who hung around for the entire day and were here this morning as well, heard a lot about what we know and don't know about alternative work arrangements, and we discussed in depth the specific risks to which workers in these arrangements are exposed to a greater degree or equal degree as standard workers. But of course, many of the workers in these arrangements don't have the risk protections that workers in the standard employment relationship have enjoyed for decades. In this panel, we're going to take a step back and look at system architecture and other macro factors that policymakers should keep in mind when trying to design better risk protections for workers in non-standard arrangements. I'm honored to be on stage with some of the leading thinkers from the public and private sector, progressive and conservative perspectives on the path forward. Peter Barnes, to my immediate left, is a writer, entrepreneur, and co-founder of Working Assets Long Distance, now CREDO Mobile. Carmen Rojas, to his left, is the CEO of the Workers Lab, an innovation lab that invests in entrepreneurs, community organizers, and technologists to develop new ways to build power for working people in the United States. To her left is Aparna Mathur, who you know well, resident scholar in economic policy at the American Enterprise Institute and an expert on paid family leave, among other things. Althea Erickson, who's senior director for global advocacy and policy at Etsy and a leading thinker on portable benefits ideas for independent contractors. And Rebecca Smith, senior counsel at the National Employment Law Project, and she directs their work structures portfolio. So welcome, everyone. Their full bios can be found in your folders. Today's panel, the concluding panel, we want to make the most interactive panel of the day. So we're going to leave about a half hour at the end for questions from you, so you can help all of us here on stage in crafting the system architecture and the policy parameters for the solutions to the problems that we've been discussing today. And I wanted to open, and I let the panelists know this as well, with a general question to them all, which is, what policies do you see as most promising to provide greater economic security to those engaged in non-standard work? I know Peter had some slides, and I believe the rest of the panelists are going to answer more informally. But Peter, you can begin. You have the clicker there.
I do. Okay. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned system architecture, because I'm going to focus on a piece of system architecture that doesn't exist yet, but I think needs to exist in the 21st century. And what I am referring to is a system of social dividends, similar to the system that Alaska has had for the last 35 years, where every Alaska resident gets a dividend from the Alaska Permanent Fund. Now, how could something like that be expanded to a national level and become part of an architecture, if you will, of lifetime economic security for everybody? So the way I see social dividends, I'll talk a little bit about how they work, but let me just say at the outset, imagine a system where everybody gets $200 a month wired automatically to their bank account or debit card, like getting $200 for pass and go in Monopoly. And that would be at $2,400 a year, and it would help everyone participate more fully in our market economy and to enjoy more security and peace of mind at all stages of life. It would also fill in a lot of the gaps in the social safety net that we've been talking about all day long. Now, I want to also make clear at the beginning that I am not talking about a universal basic income, although there are some similarities. But what I'm talking about is not enough to live on, nothing that would enable people to exit the labor market. It's more like a base income. Everybody with a valid Social Security number would get it, including non-workers. children, stay-at-home parents, unpaid caregivers, students, etc., everybody. It could be used to pay bills, reduce debt, save for college, retirement, donate to charity. It would make everybody more secure. So let me, and why is that an important part of the architecture? We've been talking about a lot of very specific problems or people that are not covered for this or that. But there is a much bigger problem that we have to address, and that is the fact that labor income as a whole is not now and will not be in the foreseeable future sufficient to sustain a large and secure middle class. Bingo. That's the fact. And this is so for a whole host of reasons which we don't need to go into here, but they include automation, globalization, financialization, the decline of worker bargaining power, and so on. The good-paying, steady jobs that my generation built the middle class on after World War II are just not coming back. All the gains in our economy now for the last 30 years seem to float to the top 1%, and the middle class is disappearing. So let's look at this architecture here for just a second. The social dividends piece is kind of like a base. Everybody gets it from birth to death, and it doesn't replace any of the existing pieces, and it doesn't preclude expanding existing pieces. It's funded from a completely different source, which is not a payroll tax or any kind of tax, but rather, as in Alaska, it's revenue that comes from assets that belong to everybody. In the case of Alaska, it's oil. In the case of a national system, it would be other things, such as the atmosphere, which belongs to everybody. Congressman Chris Van Hollen yesterday introduced a bill called the cap and dividend, which would put a cap on pollution, make polluters pay, and divide the revenue from the use of our common atmosphere equally to everybody in the form of dividends. One could think of other national assets that could be similarly priced to generate revenue that would be transformed into dividends. For example, just one example would be our financial infrastructure. Speculators use it every day to make trades that they presumably gain from, but they don't pay anything for that use of that asset. If we made them pay, it would not be a tax, it would be a fair payment for value or benefit received. So there's a whole, what I'm saying is a premise underneath this, and it would take more time than I have to explain it further, but there's a whole class of assets that are completely outside the existing revenue streams for the social safety net that could be added to it with the payout coming in the form of dividends. I could say a lot more about this, but I won't because time is short, but let me just list, if you can see that, and we can come back to it if you're interested in Q&A. There's a whole series of ancillary benefits that would flow from a social dividend system, but we'll talk about that maybe later. The last point I will make, just because I'm out of time, is that a little story about Hillary Clinton. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about this called With Liberty and Dividends for All, How to Save Our Middle Class When Jobs Don't Pay Enough. Hillary read this book, and in 2015, during the early part of the campaign, presidential campaign, she almost, but not quite, decided to make a proposal along these lines. When she wrote her memoir, What Happened After the Campaign, she explained that she was really excited about this idea. She was looking for something to add some pizzazz to her campaign. But the reason she didn't go forward and do it was that her economics team couldn't make the numbers work. Well, I can assure you that the numbers can be made to work. I think that there are probably several people in this room who could help make the numbers work. The problem, basically, is courage and boldness. And to conclude, what I would say is that we need the same kind of courage and boldness today that FDR and his team had in 1935. And that if we add social dividends to our lifetime economic security system, they will be just as beneficial, just as enduring, and just as popular as social insurance. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is a tough slot to be in, and a hard act to follow. Thank you all so much for having me here today. Again, my name is Carmen Rojas, and I run an organization called the Workers Lab. We are a lab, an innovation lab that's focused on supporting worker organizers and entrepreneurs to find new ways to build power for working people in the 21st century economy. I have a set of slides, but I've had the luxury and pleasure of spending my whole day here with you all, and I really just want to throw them out the window because I've been really provoked by the conversations and presentations today. The thing that we have been thinking about at the Workers Lab is frankly something that has come up here, but I will actually speak to more directly. So the striking thing for me as somebody who runs a worker organization, there are a couple of striking sort of features in the ecosystem. One is how siloed this conversation is from a broader or a different conversation focused on workers and building worker power and worker rights, and how siloed that and this conversation are from a financial empowerment, financialization conversation. It strikes me that those three conversations would really benefit from happening in a similar space. The other striking feature of this conversation that's helped me think about our work has been, frankly, it's kind of a reality check that we've had as an organization about where working people are at in this country. And the conversations here organized around retirement and longer term benefits fail to address the fact that most working people, half of working people in the United States, have $0 in savings. And it seems to me that neither the worker rights movement nor this space is actually speaking to the real-time, day-to-day financial duress that working people are confronting. And so for us as an organization, one of the things that we've committed to is to trying to figure out how to get people the money they need when they need it with the least amount of friction. As we've heard today, and I'm sure you guys know from your academic work and your field work, there are a number of products and services meant to even out incomes. But what we know from the data is that most working people don't experience highs and lows, they experience lows and lows. And so what we need to figure out is how to get them money when they need it without adding an extra burden onto them for solving a problem that's frankly a problem of our economy. So that's like a first hypothesis that we're putting out there, a first statement that we're putting out there. How do we build solutions that don't continue to burden poor working people to solve problems of our economy? The second is to try to figure out who pays for these solutions and to move away again from the asking people who are making, at best $15 an hour, which in a city like Washington, D.C. or New York or any place where the vast majority of poor working people live, isn't enough to sustain an individual, let alone a family of four. And so trying to figure out how we, as an organization, partner and understand how we get employers to pay, how we get platforms to pay, how we get people who are benefiting off of the labor of poor working people to actually pay into a system that allows them to access the kind of emergency cash they need when they need it. So that's the second proposition. I'd add something that that might be provocative in this crowd, but one of the things that we've been considering as an organization is that the conditions of non-standard workers, be they contractors or temporary workers, are actually really similar to the conditions that low-wage W-2 workers are confronting. And I think that this is a distinction that actually hurts, for me, from our perspective, a broader conversation about what it means or what it will take to reimagine both the safety net and an economy that can actually deliver for all working people. And so we would posit that any solution should not lead or assume that poor, low-wage W-2 workers are in one way or another, experiencing a level of benefits or security that low-earning contractors or temporary workers are experiencing. What we have found is that they are experiencing, again, the same type of financial duress. So our innovative idea is to try to actually today meet the real-time financial needs of low-wage workers, low-earning contractors, in service of creating space for them to imagine what it actually means to have a more robust safety net. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me here, and thanks to Ben for hosting this really big think session. I think it's a big challenge for all of us to, we're so focused on our micro areas and trying to figure out, what's the demographics and how do we deal with it, and now to be, sort of thinking about how do we reform social insurance generally to meet all the different challenges that workers face, I think is a daunting task. But So when I was listening to the conversation, I think, the one thing that we need to address, which relates to the changing nature of work, is how we define non-standard work and how we've defined it over time. And this is something that Carmen just pointed out. When I was looking at, what did we know about non-standard work like 10 years before, it related to a lot of night, work that was at irregular hours. So if you were looking at night shifts or evening shifts, or you were doing work on the weekends, that's what we thought of as non-standard work. And I think the difference there was that there was still an employer, there was still a tight relationship between the employer and the employee. And we were not looking at, the issues that we're dealing with today when we talk about gig economy work or contractual work, where, it's hard to define what an employee is anymore. It's hard to assign one worker to one specific employer. So I think the challenges that we're dealing with, have changed the definition of non-standard work for us, and we need to sort of look at what is it that we're losing when we made this transition from our earlier definition of non-standard work to this. And I think the biggest difference, as we've understood throughout the day, is really a lot of the benefits and protections that we assign with standard employer-employee relationships are no longer existent. So when you look at things like unemployment insurance, it made sense that the employer was taxed to fund the UI funds, whether at the state or at the federal level, because if the employee lost their job, it made sense that, it depended on how much time the employee had been with that employer and how much, wage replacement, et cetera, they should get, which was attached to that work. And now it's no longer clear. If somebody's in a gig economy job, if you're an Uber driver or one day you're a Lyft driver, who pays into that UI fund? Where does that protection come from? And that applies to, not just sort of unemployment insurance. It's things like workman compensation or work compensation. And things like pensions and retirement benefits, that relationship with the employer no longer exists. So how do we transition out of those protections to this new economy? So for me, it was really difficult to think about, well, what's the means by which we do it? And I think it's easier to start thinking of principles. What are the principles that should guide the change in the nature of work that we're seeing today? What are the principles that should ensure access to those benefits for all kinds of workers? And so I was, just sort of thinking through some of those, and I think universality is one principle. Every worker should have access to those protections, irrespective of which kind of employment relationship they're in. The second, I think the most useful is portability. We're no longer in an economy where where benefits can be tied to one employer. So you need to have benefits that are portable from across employers and across, they're basically attached to the employee and not to the employment and not to the employer. We also need flexibility. So we're not, workers are no longer in standard schedules, in standard work schedules. This is not just true of non-standard work. I think it's true of a lot of what we consider standard work as well. The hours at which we work, the nature of work itself is very different. And so we need to allow for that flexibility. And finally, I think simplicity is another principle that we need to keep in mind. We talk about multiple types of benefits. We need benefits for paid leave. We need benefits for retirement. We need benefits for disability. We need, there's so many buckets. And I think when you talk to employers, this is becoming a larger concern than the issue that we need to provide benefits. It's really dealing with multiple types of benefits across multiple states. And I think for a worker, if we're transitioning to a system where where all the benefits are tied to the worker and not the employment, I think having the simplicity of being able to pull into one bucket for every need that you might have would make the process easier and would make the transition smoother. Now, there are several good ideas. I think several people have discussed ways to fund these benefits to make them more portable. Having sort of a trust fund in which employees who have these flexible schedules, who are in gig economy work, are able to contribute. I was reading the way the UI system works, where the employer pays a certain amount of tax, based on employee wages. Why couldn't we transition or do something similar for workers? If you pay based on your earnings, you pay into a portable fund that's available to you. But I also agree with Carmen's point. A lot of low-income workers don't have enough savings. They're not going to be able to contribute as much. So I do think we need to have a role for social insurance or for a federal government stepping in and providing some kind of a wage subsidy. And I like the idea of a wage subsidy much more than even expanding the EITC, because the wage subsidy is available to you, probably on a monthly basis. So whatever earnings you have, whatever wages you earn, the government steps in and pays a certain fraction of that into your account as a subsidy that's available to you immediately. You don't wait till the end of the year for that lump sum EITC payment. That could be a lot of cash, but it's still, it's lumpy. It's not available when you need it. So I kind of like the idea of sort of doing something similar, but doing it through an account that's available to the employees, but is also subsidized to some extent, by the government. There could be pooling of risks across workers as well. We're seeing some of that with Uber and other companies saying, okay, maybe gig economy employers get together and have some sort of pooled account where their workers can contribute and get access to benefits when they need it, or it could be completely, a pooling of employees where they come together and decide, okay, we're all pooling into the system, and we have access to the benefits when we need it. I do think for things like workers' compensation, which are actually attached to the workplace, an employer contribution should be required. That's not something that the employee needs to completely bear the risk of. And then on paid leave, when we were having discussions about how we design a portable sort of paid leave policy, again, social insurance seems to make a lot of sense. An employee payroll tax that allows employees to access the benefit as they move across employers, I think is key. I think some thorny issues there are, what do you do with eligibility? Who is eligible for the benefit? Even when we talk about the self-employed workers, how much time do they have to contribute into the pool before they can start accessing the benefits? I think that's a key question. What about job protection? With certain kinds of leaves, do you get job protection? I think that's an issue that we need to talk about when we're talking about portability. So I'm going to leave it there. And this is obviously a menu of ideas. We don't know what's going to work best because work is changing constantly, employees and what they need is changing constantly. But I'm glad we're having this discussion.
Hi there, I'm Althea. I lead public policy at Etsy. For those of you who aren't familiar with Etsy, we're an online marketplace where folks can sell handmade and vintage goods and craft supplies. We are engaged in this conversation primarily because I think Etsy sellers are part of this sort of non-standard workforce, but are not the folks that you traditionally think of when you think of the non-standard workforce. And so, but they face many of the same challenges. And so we sort of jumped into this conversation because we are feeling very frustrated that while folks were describing the challenges that our sellers certainly face, many of the solutions being put forward felt totally just not applicable to them. So a little bit about our seller community. We have 1.9 million creative entrepreneurs on our platform. Almost all of them are women. It's 87% of our sellers are women. They are almost all businesses of one, working alone from their homes. And for about 30% of our sellers, their creative business is their sole occupation, not primarily always through Etsy. They're selling, to retailers and through their own website and through Etsy and through other places. But for the rest of our sellers, their creative business is supplementing other kinds of income, and we talked about that a bit this morning. I think they also differ because they are certainly in the retail sector and not the service sector, and I think often this conversation really focuses on folks who sell their labor, and our folks are selling their goods. And I think it's important to point out that they are selling both offline and online. And as I said, combining income from multiple sources. So even for those who are supplementing other income with their creative business, they are more likely to be self-employed. So you could imagine like a freelance graphic designer who also sells like stationery and cards on Etsy, and she's combining income from multiple sources to add up to her whole income. And I think just as we have been observing and participating in this conversation, my primary fear is that the current conversation sort of traps us in old models. And as a result, we will not end up with policy solutions that help everybody who's working in this non-traditional way and leave folks out. And in particular, I find Uber is not a useful model in a lot of ways because Uber looks more like traditional employment than many of the other folks. And so it's very tempting to take that and say, oh, well, we should just put it back into our old buckets and our old models, and that will just work. And I think that's not the case. Folks are combining income from multiple sources. I think also it's so tempting to ask the question, are you a worker or a business owner? And the truth is they're both. We're both. And I know there's been some great work about alternative classifications, third classifications. I actually find that not that helpful because it's gray. It's just gray all the way across. And I think instead what we need to be thinking about are what are the solutions that will work for all workers who are combining income from all different types of employment situations, but are one person or one family, and where it doesn't matter how you're earning income, you still are able to participate in this larger benefit system. So we put out a policy paper last year that was sort of trying to move the conversation forward on those, and many of the ideas that we put in there actually, there are elements of them in presentations earlier today, which was very exciting to me to see that. We started from the premise of, okay, well, if we want to create a system that works for everyone who works, regardless of how they work, what are the things that everybody needs? And so we sort of started with three things. The first, or sort of three elements. The first is a single place to manage your benefits, regardless of how you're earning income, and portable benefits accounts get at this. I think many proposals try to get at that. We proposed a federal benefits portal, which is really more of the kind of the systems infrastructure piece. You could imagine that as being very similar to the health insurance exchanges that were created through the ACA, but for all types of benefits. And in our imagination, that infrastructure would support, yes, individual, like portable benefits accounts or IRAs or things that are tied to the individual, but could also show the individual, employer-sponsored plans, union-sponsored plans, state and federal plans. And really what the federal government would be providing would be the infrastructure to provide one place where you can see it all. And I think on the infrastructure piece, the other part, we got a lot of questions when we put this out. Should it really be federal? Should it really be government? Why does government have to run everything? And actually, we don't think that. The reason we ended up with a federal proposal was because universality was the goal. And ultimately, it's got to be federal if it's going to be universal. But we also imagined a world where maybe the federal government actually just collects the data and provides the infrastructure that underpins that portal, but the private sector and the social sector could provide the front end of that and the usability. And so you could imagine it as really just an API that the federal government operates, that sort of the private sector runs the front end. The second thing that we considered was that everyone needs a way to make contributions to those benefits. And maybe they're contributions from themselves, maybe it's their employer, maybe it's matched, maybe it's not, whatever. There needs to be a way that money is moving into and paying for those accounts. I personally have been very frustrated around how it feels like every proposal focuses for social insurance and for economic security starts from the premise that we have to build it on payroll, which just automatically excludes all of our people. So we thought, well, what are the other sort of systems that we could build on? And what is the saying? Like, there's nothing certain in life except for death and taxes. So we looked at the taxes, and I know that does exclude the folks who are not part of the tax system. Many of the domestic workers talked about on the previous panels, et cetera. But our thought was, and I know this was also referenced earlier, the idea of making, basically we proposed universal withholding for 1099 workers. And that could include folks in the retail and the service sector. Many folks don't know that Etsy actually issues 1099Ks for folks who earn over a certain amount on our platform. Similar, you could harmonize the thresholds for 1099Ks and Ms and create a system where folks could, I would say, opt into withholding a portion of that income to pay for their self-employment taxes, to fund an individual benefit account. I would say opt in because everybody's businesses are different and they have different cash flow needs. A jeweler on Etsy, actually the income she earns, she needs to be spending that on, expensive stones for her next thing. It's going to be hard for her to save a particular amount, but that, allow that to be flexible, but still create that automatic deduction that you get through payroll for traditional employees. And then the last is a two-part proposal, really trying to address the challenges of income volatility, which many people here have talked about, income protection. We sort of divided the world into short-term income volatility. So an Etsy seller, for example, will sell quite a bit over the holiday season and then see her income drop in January and February. To cover that, we proposed basically tax advantage savings accounts and really just combining the existing accounts that already exist for medical, for parking, disability, dependent care. Those accounts all exist. They all have different thresholds, different requirements around them. Why not just combine them into one, allow you to save, I think it was about $13,000, which is just the sum of allowable contributions of each of those existing accounts, and allow you to then to save that, to spend that money on any of those eligible expenses. So one year, maybe you have a medical emergency, you can spend that on medical costs. Next year, maybe you have a baby, you can spend that on dependent care. You can use that money to cover your changing needs, which, as we've talked about, flexibility is so important. And then the last piece, and then I will stop talking, is focused on the long-term income volatility and the more dramatic drops in income for which unemployment insurance and others existing systems, as we talked about also earlier today, are very challenging for the self-employed. For that, we proposed, and thanks for the shout out to Andy, basically expansion of the earned income tax credit to make it a better floor, minimum floor. It already is structured in a way that works for the self-employed. It's not built on payroll, but expand it to cover a greater number of workers, make it more generous, and allow that benefit to be administered quarterly to better reflect sort of the changing fluctuations and the changing needs of the independent workforce. So those are some of our policy ideas and sort of the whys behind them. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Totally baffled about how to turn this on. Yeah.
It's probably already on.
Oh, it's already on. That makes it a lot easier. I'm Rebecca Smith, and I work for the National Employment Law Project. And I think we really think of this in three parts, three not so easy steps. I don't think I'll get a lot of dispute from this group that we think the basis really does have to be a universal and portable and flexible social insurance system. So echoing Aparna and also Nancy this morning. And that means we really have to look at the job-based exclusions from social insurance that exist now and the structure-based exclusions that exist from social insurance that exist now that we've talked about here, and the relative ungenerosity of benefits in this country. So that's kind of all very long-term. We all know that, but there are some bright spots that we talked about today. And I think the second is this question of who pays. And we work almost entirely with low-wage workers. You heard from my colleague Caitlin about home care workers, and we work with drivers and all sorts of folks who are janitors and low-wage workers. We think that we need to make some distinction about who can be expected to pay for themselves into this system and who ought to be paying for someone else. And for, our basic bottom line is that if your work is integrated into a business, if you are a janitor working for a janitorial company or a home care worker working for a home care company, and if that entity determines what you are paid, then they ought to be paying into your system. We think that the systems also ought to be available to folks who really are independent contractors who work on the platforms, perhaps with some kind of subsidy for low-wage workers, perhaps paid in part through consumer fees that then get processed perhaps through a platform. And then third, the thing that I'm most excited about right now, because I think there are no shortage of great policy ideas out there, but as Derica mentioned this morning, and as Carmen talked about, what we need is workers who have the ability to make those things happen. And one of the things that I'm excited about is this idea that started with the fight for 15 and other fights for minimum wage, or probably actually started way before that, but of wage and standard boards in particular sectors. And there's been some thinking about that for domestic workers. There have been some thinking about that for transportation network company drivers, where you have a commission in which workers are represented, if not overrepresented, and where workers can themselves negotiate for the kinds of benefits that they think are most important to them, built on this base of social insurance. And I suspect that for a lot of workers, and this is what I hear from organizers, is that workers would prefer to have more money in their pocket now than some of the things that we are building in or thinking we would like to build in later. But at bottom, workers ought to be able to negotiate for those things. And so I think this idea of a wage and standard board, maybe that's combined with portable benefits, maybe not, is one that's very exciting, especially in sectors where there is organizing happening.
Thank you very much. Those were some terrific ideas from all of you, so I think we could probably just end the panel right now, but I do have some questions, some follow-up questions. So Peter, to start with you, social insurance is typically, so income security programs in social insurance provide wage replacement. right, to protect families, workers and their families from downward social mobility when an insured event happens. Proponents of universal basic income, and I know that you also are involved in that movement, talk about a universal basic income that might be north of $1,000 that could potentially replace all existing social programs, or others think it could be alongside existing programs. But what you propose today is something more modest. It's using social dividends to provide a couple of $100s of extra income to stabilize people's finances. So that's a flat rate benefit as opposed to a wage replacement approach. If you're tapping a new revenue source like some kind of sovereign wealth source to provide this benefit, and there's a lot of money that is available through once you've agreed upon what that external revenue source is, why use it for a flat rate benefit to all instead of using it in a more targeted fashion?
First of all, good question. Let me say that I would envision that dividends would be taxed as other forms of income are, so that to the extent that it makes no sense to give a dividend to Bill Gates because based on need, at least he'd pay 30–40% of it back into the system. Also, people could opt out. They don't have to get these dividends if they don't want them. Go back to the beginning of your question about...
Well, so the social insurance programs provide wage replacement
Right.
and sort of a more targeted...
Right. Well, the idea behind social dividends is to make an important distinction between income and generally and wage-based income, labor income. The underlying theory, as I said, is that labor income is never again going to be enough to sustain a middle class. And I think that's a fact. Until it's disproved, I will maintain it. So we need non-labor sources of income that everybody has a right to. That would be a part of a new social contract, that we all have a right to a certain amount of income just for being Americans and being part of our society. No further questions asked. If you have to be a legal resident, you have to be eligible for Social Security. So that would be the eligibility standards. But after that, forget about whether you have a standard job or a non-standard job or any of those things. You deserve regular monthly income. And all these other programs that have been talked about are fine and would dovetail nicely in this architecture. If you're talking about income volatility or the need for people to save for rainy days, the main problem that makes it hard for people to save is that they don't have enough income. So if you're spitting out $200 a month, let's say, and people get it, and they get on their iPhones, and they say, oh, I just got my $200 this month, and now I have these options. I can check it over to my checking account and then spend it because I have to pay the rent. Or I can check it over to my savings, my rainy day savings account, or my individual development account, or my kids' college savings account, or I can donate it to a good nonprofit. You're stimulating a lot of good things with this revenue that is coming out of an untapped revenue source that rightfully belongs to everybody as non-labor income.
Thank you. So that touches on a broader issue of solidarity, and the idea of finding the right level, the right locus, or the right level, micro, macro. Is it a profession? Is it an industry or an organization? Is it the state level, the national level? What do you think? This is a question for the panel as a whole. What do you think is a good level or locus where to focus efforts to improve job quality? To what extent is it better to start on the micro level because workers who work together, Marx said, if you work in the same firm, you develop consciousness and that drives, increases workers' power and ultimately control over their wages and their work. but on the other hand, if you only do it on a micro basis, then only the workers who are most able to organize get the better quality jobs, whereas the weaker or vulnerable workers are left out of whatever accomplishments you get. There's solidarity to some extent at the local level where people know each other and want to have some kind of sense of tangible cooperation beyond just their work. And then at the national level, you have this notion that you talked about, Peter, of national identity, which is something you can tap into. So what level do you think is a good level to focus on?
That is quite the question. And I'm going to, one of the things that I feel like that question, and frankly this day has helped me think about, based on the conversations that people have been, that I've been having individually with people and based on presentations, and frankly based on this panel, are what are the benefits that people in this country should depend on or should expect to get because they work, and what are the benefits that people should just depend to get, that they should just get untied to work. And I think that the question of how we organize a labor movement that builds solidarity amongst workers to create a new social safety net or a new social compact is one question. But what I heard today and what I found to be most inspiring today were those people who posited an idea that we should actually all just hope to have decent health care, or hope to have decent child care or elder care, regardless of our status as workers. And I worry that deepening the connection or relying on worker solidarity as the sole way to imagine a state that provides for its residents and citizens will only continue to fragment the way that we want our economy and our democracy to work in service of bolstering everybody. So I would ask a different question, which is what do we want this worker solidarity to be for? And then what do we want sort of common solidarity? What do we want the state to provide in service of us? I worry about Peter's proposition because I don't want a $200 check. I want to send my kid decent schools. I want to know that that's going to be there. I want to know that like the roads and the lights are going to be on. And I know that many people in the sort of UBI cash transfer world don't see it as and those two things as disconnected, but I don't have any evidence that in the history of this country that one won't be at the expense of the other, that giving people $200 won't come at the expense of public schools or government, things that we have taken for granted, that government provides for us every single day. So that's how I would respond to that question.
Yeah, I think going back to the principle of universality and uniformity, I think when I look at it in terms of, let's say, a specific benefit like paid leave, I would love for it to be at the federal level, because I think, if we agree that there's a standard definition of what's a good job or what's a good benefit for employers to provide, I think doing it in a manner that ensures access, irrespective of where you are, which employer you're working for, which state you're in, which locality you live in, I think doing it at the federal level would ensure that uniform access is available all over the country. Whereas if we start saying, okay, this has to be a state issue, and I'm not at all against states experimenting and doing things differently and layering on top of what's happening at the federal level. But I think if when that happens, what you find is that there's a limit to how much access really opens up for especially the lowest wage workers, because employers may adopt certain benefits which may only go to, let's say, their full-time employees, or may only go to their higher earning workers, or states may adopt certain rules that leave out the lowest wage workers. But I think if you're talking about a benefit that we think should be uniformly available, is what defines a good job, I think doing it at the federal level and ensuring that those standards are met across the country, I think would be a great start.
Terrific. Before we go further, if the Academy staff could start collecting questions, or if you could start writing your questions, please pass them. They'll be collected. We want to move to audience Q&A soon. Becky, could you tell us about the law in the bill that was introduced in Washington State last year? So obviously the state is one level at which this can be, that improvements in this area can be attempted. Tell us about the bill in Washington.
Yeah, I was actually going to say also about what level. I think, as a practical matter, where things are happening is at the local and at the state level, and they are the laboratories, as someone was saying last night. And I think that as we get deeper into paid sick, the paid sick laws get better. As we get deeper into paid leave, the paid leave laws get better. And at some point, there will be a tipping point, and we will be able to have a federal program. But anyway, the proposal in Washington State was a portable benefits proposal that would require companies to pay. Last year it was 25%. This year it's 15% of wages up to a cap into a portable benefits fund that would be managed by a workers' organization. Last year there was a work session. This year it went to first hearing. I don't think anyone thinks this is going to happen right away. I think the good part about it is that it has started a conversation. And I think the basic framework is a good one that reflects, I think, the principles that we think are most important about portable benefits. And as we have seen it this year, it's moved a little further to incorporating social insurance as well, with a requirement that folks pay into workers' compensation. I think there's still a lot of questions about portable benefit systems, and even though the proposal in Washington State says the provision of benefits doesn't count either for or against you in terms of whether you're an employer or not. This year we've included a definition of who's misclassified that's kind of along the lines of what I've just said. You're an employee if your work is integrated and if you can't set your own wages. And so those folks are out. But it's not clear really what the universe is. And I have questions as well about viability. As we've talked about a lot today, people are in and out of a lot of these jobs. And the thought that you would have 29 cents in a retirement account somewhere, and then a workers' organization would have to be administering 100,000 of those accounts seems to me one that we need, a tough nut to crack, and that we need to crack. One piece in Washington is, I think, a pretty universal belief that we need to understand this landscape a little better, and so we're hopeful that in the governor's budget it will survive a study on who's doing what and what people's demographics and circumstances and second jobs and all those questions that we all have will be answered at some point for our state, and that will help us design a portable benefit system as well.
Thank you very much. So the state is obviously one level where you can approach this. Another would be the platforms themselves. So having a representative of a platform here at our conference, Althea, what did you see as the role of platforms in developing and providing these kinds of risk protections?
Yeah, so I think, I think the who pays, I'm just going to address the sort of who pays question, because I think that one is really challenging. And it's challenging because platforms are diverse and heterogeneous. I feel like everybody's had trouble saying that word all day long. There's a lot of different kinds of platforms out there, and their business models are very different. How big they are is very different, like what level they are and sort of starting and growing. 15%, like that makes my eyes bulge out of my head, because Etsy takes 3.5% of every transaction. So if Etsy were, and Etsy's not included in that proposal, but if we were, you would just basically have to raise prices on Etsy's platform to cover that, and ultimately the workers pay for that anyway. So it's not actually, it's just shifting the cost to them for our model, and I know there are many other models for whom that would be the case. So it just makes me nervous, and I think we struggled with this when we wrote our paper, where we really tried to talk about like not do a find and replace of like employer for platform or platform for employer, but really started talking about payers, like who is paying people. But then ultimately, honestly, you get to like a consumption tax or something, because if you get down to the chain to what is most universal, and then you basically are talking about a broad-based tax that's the government is redistributing wealth, and that's great and fine. But it's challenging. I think separate from the payment question, I actually think platforms are very well equipped to provide that infrastructure and already have built much of the infrastructure required. They already have payment systems. They already, and so that's why I did have to go to my CEO and say, are you okay with me proposing that Etsy withhold taxes for our folks? That would definitely be a new administrative burden for us. And he was like, yeah, that yes, it would be more costly for us, but we could handle that. We could build on our existing systems that I feel like you would have a much easier time with and actually makes sense for the role that many of these platforms are playing, sort of regardless of what sector and what structure. The other thing I think is really important is we know our people. And so right now, when there are a lot of open questions about what do you do and who are these people and what do they need, I think platforms can become a really, really great research partners and providing data about the communities that we serve and also insights into what they need and what they don't. And we put out this policy paper last year and are now like really excited to think about different pilots we could be doing with different groups and researchers. And I'll just raise my hand and say, if you're looking to do a pilot on some ideas, I've got some Etsy sellers that I'd love to include. But I do think that particularly where we are in the debate right now and in the policy formation process, platforms can be like very helpful in creating access points to these communities.
So we have questions from the audience, and there's several questions on this along the same lines, which all have to do with that. We're talking about how to provide benefits out of already low wages to workers, and are we giving up on raising wages and economic security from work? Why accept that all the gains from the productivity increases go to the top? Why should taxpayers subsidize corporations? Why wouldn't a wage subsidy just lead to lower wages, et cetera? So how would you address those concerns about increasing the wages and increasing all the quality of all jobs and not just trying to provide benefits from meager benefits on top of meager wages? Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, we are not. I mean, I think that a couple of the things that we're working on outside of this are focused on wholly shifting practices in our economy towards more cooperative. So another project of the Workers Lab is working with the 10th largest ag company in the country to shift away from direct contract labor to actually, we've built a labor cooperative, which will be the largest labor cooperative in the country where the workers get 5% equity in the company, and they set wages, benefits, and standards directly with the grower. So I have not given up on increasing wages. I do think that we need to have a conversation about the state and taxation. And so one of the things, so many people, I'm sure, have heard about the universal basic income experiment in Stockton. One of the unstated sort of, it sounds like the city of Stockton is running an experiment, but really it's tech entrepreneurs who are running that experiment in the city of Stockton. And I wonder what it means when those people want to run experiments in our city without actually wanting to assume a greater tax burden for actually doing more transfer. I don't want to find ways for us to subsidize, us as the people of this country, subsidize corporations. I more so want to figure out how we imagine a world where we have a shared fate in our economy and working people, it's not on the backs of working people that a small percentage of corporations and individuals in corporations get very, very rich.
So that takes us back to the earlier question about what level to focus on, the micro, state, or national level. It would seem that a lot of the work that you do, a lot of the great work that your organization does, is focused on enhancing worker voice, worker participation, worker ownership in what they produce, And that not only can yield improved job quality, but also higher wages, share in profits, et cetera. So that would seem to argue for focusing on the worker level or the industry level rather than just on the political level.
Yeah, we're not I mean, I think we play an interesting role because we're trying, especially in this political climate, and even before this political climate, to find openings in the market, to be able to actually grab and take worker power, right? So in this agricultural context, immigrants weren't coming to take these crappy jobs. And there was a labor shortage, like who would have thought? And we had the grower come to us to ask for an intervention. And so we saw an opening to shift practices in the industry. As an organization, we are focused on the market, but know that sort of our brother and sister organizations like the National Domestic Workers Alliance that was mentioned earlier today, Restaurant Opportunity Center, are actively trying to pass policies. And I don't think that those two things can happen disconnected from each other.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the ideal way to raise wages is just to invest in the workers themselves, and that can happen through more training. I think we're seeing experiments around the country, paid apprenticeship programs, I think, that are increasing the skills base of these workers. So the more we invest in their skills, in their training, I think the more likelihood that there will be a bigger demand for those workers and their wages are likely to go up. I also disagree with the idea that providing a wage subsidy is a way to reduce wages. I think wage subsidies and earning subsidies like the EITC are a great way to supplement incomes for low-income workers. And I think the evidence on those kinds of programs suggests that people are much more likely to be engaged in the workforce, to be more active, to have more active labor force participation rates if you provide those subsidies. Whereas in the absence of those subsidies, you have such a low wage coming from the employer that people are much more likely to drop out, I would imagine. So I don't think this is an argument against providing a wage subsidy, but absolutely, there are better ways to improve the skill sets of workers so that there's a greater demand for those workers. And as the labor market tightens even more, the demand for workers goes up and the wages are likely to go up.
But that's in a context, over half of our jobs are bad jobs as well. So half working people don't have savings, and half of the jobs that our economy is creating are service sector jobs, restaurant jobs. They are in retail. We are training people for jobs that our economy isn't producing. So it's not a skills problem. Again, I would posit that the way we should be approaching this issue is not by continuing to add a time or money burden onto people who are already taxed by the economy, and instead imagine a way that we can shift the economy to make people who, my mom, for example, cleaned a bank. And she was this janitorial story that we heard David Wheel tell earlier. She worked at the bank and she got offered training and she ended up, becoming a secretary at that bank. And that changed everything. And I don't think that work has changed, and no amount of sort of training external as an additional burden would have improved her life. It was that her employer saw her as part of benefiting the company. And I feel like the question that continues to rattle for me is, how do we come up with solutions that don't add additional strain or pressure to people who are overly taxed, don't have enough time, and are making impossible choices every day?
So to follow up on that, it gets to the issue, how can we bring sort of new money into the system and of funding benefits, quality jobs for independent contractors and other workers in alternative arrangements? What do you think of the options? We have to obviously replace the employer contribution somehow, right? What do you think of the idea of consumers paying? Certainly consumers, a lot of people engage domestic care workers, and some of them are low income, but not all of them are low income, right? Companies that engage creatives, graphic designers, and so forth. A lot of those people have resources. Do you see potential for consumers or utilizers of labor or services, or purchasers of goods for that matter, to pay a prorated contribution to replace the former employer contribution and bring money into the system and provide better benefits?
Yeah, I mean, that was something we struggled with, like, should we put this in our paper? And ultimately we didn't, because we didn't think it would be that palatable. But ultimately, when you sort of dig down into what are the common denominators, on the consumption side, it seems to me that, like, somebody is purchasing a service or somebody is purchasing a good, and in a world where fewer and fewer people have employers and you have to provide more income into, or more money into the system in order to cover those benefits, that seems like the obvious answer to me. The one thing I would also say on the wages side, and sort of like how do we put more money in and get people paid more, is it's also worth thinking about for that sector of non-traditional workers who are setting their own wages or setting their own prices in a retail setting. That is very hard to do, and to set yourself up for parity, even with W-2 folks. So, self-employed people often underprice their pay because they're not taking into account self-employment, like all of the additional taxes and costs that are sort of baked into W-2 employees' take-home pay. Similarly, for Etsy sellers, many of our sellers are sort of artists and designers who are exceptional at making beautiful things, but don't come to retail with an ingrained sense of, okay, I need to, calculate my labor plus my cost to get to a price of goods that is actually going to deliver me a living wage. And so, in some set, and I totally agree with Carmen, like, it's not just like train. I think in some ways we thought our universal withholding proposal for 1099s would help people create more apples to apples comparison between what they could get paid in W-2 work and what they can get paid in 1099 work. But I think that's a major challenge we have to struggle with as people set their own prices and wages.
Peter?
You talked about a consumption tax as a possible source of revenue for some of these benefits or even wage subsidies. I think that's an interesting idea. I would note that in Europe, most of the safety net is funded by value-added tax. So there's no reason. So I think one of the points I'm making, and I think it is that even though most everybody in the room is kind of grown up on the notion of social insurance as something built around payroll contributions, I think we have to recognize that that revenue source is more or less maxed out at this point, and that if we're going to make new leaps, and we have to sustain, we have to save what we've got already, so there's a whole need there. But if we want to go further than where we are, we do need new revenue sources, and we should have a discussion about that. That is a possibility. But the reason I prefer these Commonwealth sources has to do with something Henry Aaron said earlier, that one of the reasons Social Security is so enduring is that there's a good story behind it. The story there is I paid in, therefore I have a right to get out. One of the reasons the Alaska Permanent Fund is so enduring and so popular is that it has a good story. Hey, this stuff belongs to all of us. I'm just getting a dividend from stuff that I'm a co-owner of. And that's what people in Alaska think. They don't think their dividend is some kind of a handout or welfare program. They think it's their legitimate right as residents of Alaska. So I think that story is a strong reason to look at these Commonwealth revenue streams as as a good supplement to payroll-based revenue streams.
Thank you. Becky, you've written about the need for universal benefits that have employer contributions but are perhaps subsidized by general revenues. That's another source of funding, obviously, to help increase the size of the pool of money that is available to provide quality jobs. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I think when we were talking about the paid leave and other bills that require the self-employed to just pay half rather than the whole, that in fact is a public subsidy. And the fact that companies are not paying into Social Security for their workers right now is in fact a public subsidy as well. So I think there is an opportunity there. Just to kind of go back full circle, I think one of our biggest challenges really is restoring corporate accountability. As one of my coworkers is saying, corporations have an entire menu of things that they can do to distance themselves from responsibility for workers, whether it's franchising, calling workers independent contractors, using a third-party logistics company, a temp agency, a staffing agency, all those things. And about a year ago, we did some focus groups and a survey in which the overwhelming response from voters was that that is a bad thing. We understand that subcontracting, abusive subcontracting, is a bad thing for the economy. And as David was talking this morning, the two Kodak workers, labor standards go down when you start going down and down and down this chain. And so I think one huge task for us is to restore that norm where corporations are responsible to individuals, and that's a huge one, but it's one that I think people understand, and how we translate that into an action is a huge task.
Can I name just one more source of income, which would be the employer-based health insurance deduction, which we spend so much money on. We already spend so much money subsidizing employer-based care, and health insurance and benefits. And so that pot of money exists. If you reallocated that towards benefits that were universal and not just employer-based, you would have quite a bit of money to start with.
So we just have a few minutes left, so let's try to end on an optimistic note. So David Michaels was saying earlier today that we need to have a conversation about responsibility in this country. And he was focusing on the corporate level, saying, in Australia they have this notion of duty of care. Whoever controls the work process also has a duty to care for the workers. Do you see a conversation around responsibility emerging in this country in the coming years, whether at the national level or the corporate level, community level? And if so, or how could you see a conversation about responsibility developing?
That's a great question. I think, I do think that, corporations have changed probably as, how much they used to invest in workers before, and they're probably investing less today. But I think it's also, as we're discussing here, it's a changing nature of work. Employees are not tied to employers anymore, and I think that is reflected in the training, the lack of sort of corporate training that we're seeing today, because employers realize, well, this worker is not going to be with me for the next 30 years. And so I think those sort of ties are getting more frayed, and so I think the debate today is not about can companies become more responsible for their workers, but really what's the way to grant workers the same benefits, the same protections, the same training, all the other stuff that used to come before with that relationship in a different way. So I don't view this as I don't view this as the onus being on the company anymore, frankly, to provide all of these benefits, to provide all of the training. I think there's been a change in that relationship, and that's what we are here to acknowledge. So, yeah, somebody needs to take on that responsibility, and maybe it's coming more at the federal, state, and local level, and maybe there are other ways to provide it. But I think that's an issue worth exploring. But definitely that relationship is changing quite a bit.
Carmen?
Yeah, I think that we're talking about these systems as if they are not symbiotic in relationship with each other. So corporations do not exist on an island in and of themselves. They should be regulated by government. and they should be taxed by government, and they should be managed by government. And we are living in a time where, frankly, like, things are upside down. And I believe that what we should be working towards. So what is exciting to me are those opportunities or openings to shift the world right side up. And ensure that government is doing the work of supporting and expanding the public good to all people who live in this country, regardless of who their employer is and what they do every day. I don't think work has changed. We still need janitorial workers. We still need teachers. It's the expectations that workers have of work has changed. And I think that we can slip into a conversation about the changing nature of work as if now we are all being asked to do something different. Well, we need people to do the same things. It's just that we're not delivering for those people who are doing the same things. And so for me, I think what's exciting is the work that a number of worker organizers are leading in trying to put us right side up.
Okay. Just a few more seconds, so quick thoughts.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think that in my dream world, maybe I'll just step back and say, I think there is a role for corporations to play a much more like civic engagement role and in advocating for sensible policies and moving past sort of, and this is where I come from because I am an advocate for, representing a company, but I think that companies traditionally have advocated for their own self-interest, and that needs to change, and companies need to be advocating for the public interest and using their voice in that way, including advocating for workers and others. I will just say that before I worked at Etsy, I worked in the nonprofit and foundation world, and it was very hard for me to get government people to respond to me. And now I have a .com email address, and whenever I email, it's like, yeah, we'll definitely meet with you, no problem. Like, we don't hire lobbyists because we don't need them. And that is a very different dynamic. There is a lot of power in business, and I think it has traditionally been used for self-interest, but I think if more companies are stepping up and taking positions on things that are not specific to their corporate self-interest, particularly lately. In my future imagination, if more companies were doing that, it would be so much better.
Terrific. Yeah. We have to wrap up, but I would just add one more word, which is I think the consumers have been getting off scot-free in the last decade or two. It shouldn't be that cheap to take an Uber across town. It shouldn't be that cheap to get your groceries delivered. And all the different services that are available now, I think they could cost twice as much, and workers could get paid more, and it would bring money into the system to improve quality jobs. So join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you very much for attending our conference. Please fill out your blue evaluation forms. And I wanted to let you know we have to vacate this room in about 7 minutes. So please continue your conversations in the hallway or in the lobby. Thank you.
Good talk.